Okay guys, what we're going to do today is we're going to use the jig to grind a nice bevel grind on these blades. And we're going to try to avoid the mistakes that I've been making in the past. These are the steps. The goal is to get an even grind on these blades. So to do that, I need to mark the center line on the blade edge, then locate and mark the plunge line on both sides exactly with my little jig. Then set a bevel jig to 8 degrees, and then install 1/4-inch stop screws. Must be identical on both sides, because when you flip the blade from side to side, it has to be a mirror image. Then I lock the blade down with a pair of vice grips. Then I put 36 grit belt on the grinder, and then I move to the grinder platform. Then I start the grind. It's critical to watch that the grind is parallel. That is, moving from side to side, it must be exactly straight and parallel to the grinding table. Then I start a 1/4-inch back from the final grind plunge line, which will be made up in the finer grits. As I move into the finer grits, I'll clean up the plunge line. I set the speed on the variable speed grinder to about 80% to start. 80% on the heavy grits, and then as I get to the finer grits, I back that back on down probably to about 40 or less. Then most important is to keep the blade cool. So I have a water bucket right next to the grinder, and every time I make a pass, I do a dip. Then I grind to almost to the center line on the blade that was scribed earlier. And then I move through the grits from 36 to 60 to 120 to 220. I watch all the cuts. Every time I make a cut, I tip it up and look to see how I'm doing, and I even up things that are not good. Then I finish with a Scotch-Brite coarse belt, and then I'm all done. All right, so here's what we're trying to do. These are the blades that I'm working on. And if you can see, the top blade has lots of imperfections, waves and wobbles, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. By using a jig, I'm hoping to come out with something that looks more like the bottom one. And the bottom one is nice and clean and straight. All right, and here's the jig that I use, and I'll show how that works in a minute. Then here's the grinder set up with a flat platen, 36 grit to start. And then right next to the grinder is a bucket of water used to dip. You have to keep those blades cool, especially because the grit that I'm using right now, the blade diameter that I'm using right now is thin steel. So when you have thin steel, you've just got to be careful not to burn the tip. All right, so here's the process. These have already been done. I'm just going through to show what the process was like. I marked the center line of the steel blank with mainly I just used a drill bit. I put black marking on the blade and then a drill bit like this to mark the center of the blade. After that's all done, it's time now to set up the jig. This jig is set at 8 degrees. If you can see the 8 degrees right there. What that means is the bevel is tipped that way, 8 degrees. All right. So then I put stop screws in on both sides of this jig. And what the stop screws do on both sides, identical, is so that I can lock the blade in and then flip it from side to side. So these stop screws are just simply screws with nuts. These are 1/4-inch nuts just to tighten and keep them in place. The blade will lie on these stop screws so that you get a consistent grind every time. So the way this is done is this blade is set onto the jig, and I've marked a point on this side where it has to be flush and tight to the jig. There's one just like it on the other side here also, so that the blade can be flush and tight to the jig. So we'll start out on one side. Over here. I'm making sure that this blade is tight and touches these two stop screws. Then what I do is I take vice grip and I lock that bad boy down. Okay, then we move over to the grinder and we grind. And when we're done with one side, and by done, I mean I've taken it almost all the way to the center line that I scribed on the cutting blade. When it's almost done, I'll take it off. I'll flip it over for the mirror side on the other side. And here again, it's a matter of getting this tight to the same point as I had on the front. When I'm sure that's right, I lock it down with vice grips, and then we go to the grinder and we grind the other side. And same thing, we're looking to bring it close to that center line on the cutting edge. All right. So now we move over to the grinder with the jig in place. One very important part that you should never overlook is light. I have these little machine lights, magnetic, that shine right on my work. So as I grind, I can look directly down onto that cut. So I would start this and parallel. What I mean by parallel is that this jig has to move parallel to the table. So side to side, it moves parallel. You can't do this, you can't do this. What makes it nice about the jig is that it allows you to be exactly perfect every time. So I would start my grind and I would hold the belt right next to the final plunge line. I'd leave a little bit of room because as I go through the belts and get finer and finer, I'll adjust those out. Okay, so then I do the grind. I go right across and out. And very careful about the tip because this is thin material. This belt steel, this blade steel is thin material. You got to be just very careful you don't burn that tip because it'll burn in just a fraction of a second. So I move parallel all the way across and out. And after I do that, I do a dip in the water, bring it back up, and do another grind, parallel. each time parallel. And after I grind, I tip it up and look to see how I'm doing, because I want to make sure that I don't have any waves or dips or imperfections. So this is when you get your big grind. The 36 grit belt is what takes off the majority of the steel. All the other belts are just a matter of polishing out the prior grit scratches. Okay? So do this, and when that's done on this side, I go back to the table and I flip the knife over like a mirror to the other side, and I grind that. Once the grind is all finished, and I mean, I think it's probably as even and perfect as I can make it, and I start going up through the grits on the belts. And each time I go to a finer grit, I turn down the speed a little bit. When I get down to the 220, I have the speed down around 30. And so 30% on the variable voltage regulator. So then when I get the 220 finished, then I'll pull the abrasive belts off and I put on a Scotch-Brite, coarse. And I do the same thing with the coarse Scotch-Brite. And that puts a nice polish on the blades, and then it's pretty much ready for heat treat. All right.